Good afternoon. My name is Veronica Blatt, and I'm the Communications Director for NPA Worldwide. I want to thank you all for being part of today's webinar with Wilson Cole from Adams, Evans, and Ross. This is our last installment of our 2020 webinar series. Hope you have found value in this monthly training program. We are going to continue it in 2021, and we will be kicking that off on Thursday, January 7th with a session with Jeff Kay. That'll be at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and we are scheduled for the first Thursday of the month, each month in 2021, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. In the way of housekeeping, we are recording today's session, and everyone who signed up will get a link to the recording. We will have some time at the end for questions, and you can put your questions right in the Q&A pod, and we'll read those and get to them at the end. Wilson Cole is the president of Adams, Evans, and Ross, the nation's largest credit and collection firm that specifically collects for the staffing and recruiting industry. He's been a longtime partner of NPA Worldwide and supporter, and we are very thankful for that and for the great content that he provides to us and to our members, and the great service that he offers. Wilson, I will turn it over to you.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Veronica. I appreciate you guys having me on for the webinar, and we've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into the subject on it. And, you know, one thing that COVID and this weirdness that's been 2020 has taught us is that businesses are amazingly resilient, and there's still plenty of commerce going on. But when this thing first took off, the government was panicked, as a lot of business owners were, and the government passed some really neat programs. And I'm going to spend the first few minutes talking about, if I were sitting on your side of the desk, what I would do, and then we're going to cover a couple of subjects outside of credit, and then we're going to get into some things that you can do to make sure as you go into 2021 that you guys have good systems in place and practice best credit and collections practices. But what I want to cover right now on the first side of it, and let me first say, I've been in business 30 years. We've been self-funded for probably the last 11 or 12 years. I'm not a big loan guy. But let me tell you, if you have not done an SBA loan, I strongly suggest that you take a look at it. It's an EIDL loan. It's a Corona economic disasters loan. It is not the PPP loan that everybody did with payroll. This is in addition. And these EIDL or economic disaster loans were designed for, perfect example. I have a place down in Gulf Shores, and occasionally, about every 5 to 10 years, it gets hit by a hurricane. All the merchants down there, when they go and apply for SBA economics, and if a restaurant's closed down, the SBA will give them basically emergency loans to keep them in business until they get over the hurdle. Well, back in March and April, before they knew what was really going on with this coronavirus, the government passed, and they have yet extended it. And the terms, if you were to go and just get a regular SBA loan, it's going to be anywhere from 6 to 8%. You're going to have to put 20% down, and it's going to be a 7 to maybe a 10-year loan, but typically a 7 or an 8-year loan. These EIDL loans, two things about them, and they pretty much have maxed them at $150,000. I think you can appeal it and try to get more, but you're maxed at $150,000. And my suggestion is you don't try to get more, and here's the reason why. Is if they are under $200,000, the government is waiving personal guarantees. If it's under $25,000, they're not even getting a security interest in your business. Now, if you use a funding source, or you go to a bank and you get a loan, they always file a UCC, which makes them a secured creditor on the business, which basically secures up your assets. Most recruiters, like most service companies, you may have a name, you have a website, but it's not like you're sitting with massive amounts of assets. And so that's really not as big of an ordeal. But the fact that these loans are not personally guaranteed is huge. So let's say if you're, 60 years old and you say, okay, I'm going to run this thing out another 5 or 10 years. Now, hopefully the 150 or 100,000, whatever you would get, you would be able to make way more than that in any type of business investment and get the government paid back. But if things were to go sideways, you're not personally guaranteed. Also, these are 30-year loans at 3.75% interest. Never in the history of business lending will any business out there be able to get a 150 non-guaranteed loan, 30-year terms at 3.75. And, it's one of those situations to where if you're going to use it, one thing that I did was we have 4 companies here. And each of the companies I had run through and get these loans. One, Adams, Evans, and Ross, which it took about 6 to 8 weeks. Then we did the backdoor hire software. It took about 3 weeks when we ran Recruiting and Staffing Solutions magazine through. They had gotten this thing so honed up to when you make the application and you get the money, it was about 7 or 8 days. So they're moving relatively quickly. These loans are not going to be around there for very long. So let me also tell you that if you have a client that is complaining or concerned about their cash flow, you can do wonders by directing them to it. And if you go out and look up under SBA COVID loans, I wouldn't go through a broker. There's a direct link. If somebody emails me, wilson@aercollections.com, my assistant will get you the link to the SBA, but you can also Google it. And it's a direct link. It's roughly about a 3-page application, takes about 10 minutes. And the biggest thing is make sure that you're not a convicted felon. And I think that there's something in there where you can't be a strip joint or something along those lines, or a casino, but those are about the only limitations. So, but if you refer these loans over to your clients, it may very well help them get in enough capital to where they can expand, their businesses, they can hire new staff, and it may actually create opportunities for you to help prime your clients full of cash to where they can start hiring and you can get placements. Now, there are some restrictions. You cannot go and put a pool in your backyard or buy a new Tesla. It's a working capital loan that has to stay in the company. It doesn't tell you that you have to spend it in the first 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. There is no delineation on that. But what a lot of small businesses do, and what we've always done, is I always kept a significant, at least to me, significant amount of money sitting in the bank to cover if there was a bad month or a bad 2 months, to where it was just sitting there relatively in cash for the most part, or cash equivalent, to where we didn't have the cash flow issues. We could meet our payrolls and things on those lines. What that also allows you to do, though, is if you get the injection of the SBA funds, you can pull whatever personal cash that you had out or had set in over to the side and free that up. But I think that there's a really neat marketing tool that you can utilize with your clients on if they're complaining, and you may have some clients that are in trouble of going out of business. These loans very well may be a lifeline to them. So the reason I'm also pushing these COVID loans, which, my wife always says, oh my God, are you getting a kickback? And the answer to that is absolutely not. But what's going to happen, in my opinion, in the next 6 to 12 months when we get over this pandemic, the government is going to pull massive amounts of cash back out of the economy. And, in the old days, whenever you would want to speed up or slow down an economy, you would, if the interest rates were at 7 or 8%, you drop them to 5. Everybody goes out, starts spending money. When it starts to overheat, then they start raising it back up to 6 and 7%, and it kind of slows it down. In the Carter administration, way back when, and I'm giving my age, when it jumped up to 18%, they were trying to keep hyperinflation from kicking in. What they have now is interest rates are, by all practical purposes, at 0. And so there is no way to speed or slow the economy up outside of dumping massive amounts of cash in and pulling massive amounts of cash out. It's always been very difficult for small businesses to borrow money, in my opinion, when you get into May, June, July, August of next year. Having access to any reasonable type of credit line is going to be very difficult. Even if you own property, which a lot of business owners, they would go out and buy their office, spend, just using round numbers, $300,000 on a building, and then they pay it down, and then they can use that as a credit line. Well, the flip side of it is typically a bank will loan you 75 cents for every dollar of something that you have for value. If you're a really good client, they'll give you 80 or 85% to value. But if real estate prices were to drop, then your credit line can drop, or all of a sudden the banks get concerned and they drop it down to where they're only going to loan 60% of value or something along those lines. So tough credit is going to come, and it may not affect you. A lot of you guys have been in business a long time, managed your cash well, but what's going to happen is your clients may not have had that same frugalness, and credit is going to be a problem. And what they're going to do when credit's a problem, they use vendor credit. And with vendor credit, they typically can pay vendor credit a little slow. And just so everybody knows, you are vendor credit. So now let me kind of jump in, and here's what I want you to do over the next 90 days as this thing starts moving forward. You can go out, and we have a credit product. I know Dun & Bradstreet has a credit product. I would go out and recheck everybody's credit. Now, I realize a lot of recruiting clients say, Wilson, I do recruiting. They're not going to give me their credit information. And I get that. If you're doing contract, you darn sure better be pulling credit and seeing what you're looking at, because you may say, well, Wilson, I'm using a funding source and it's not a problem. If you're using a funding source, just so you know, in 99% of the cases, you are still on the hook if your client doesn't pay you. So if you extend out credit, the funding company pays you or the factoring company pays you, but your client doesn't pay for those contractors in 60 or 90 days, guess what? That gets charged back to you, and the funding company is coming back asking for their money back. And so what you can do is you can do this a little covertly with if you wanted to utilize our credit screens. I mean, I think it's like $50 a month, and we'll check unlimited. There's other, USA Credit. There's some pretty cheap resources out there, but I recommend that you check the company's credit, because they could have been a wonderful client for you in February, but all of a sudden now they're through COVID. Everybody's been in quarantine. Maybe they didn't like their spouse as much as they did in January or February, and now they're getting a divorce on top of it. That once very profitable company could be in trouble, and all of a sudden they go out trying to hire staff to speed up cash flow, and then lo and behold, you run into this issue here. So go back and check everybody's credit. Go back, do a Google search. Just simply, something as simple as a Google search. We have a client right now that just turned over a manufacturing facility out of the Midwest. This is the third recruiter that has placed candidates and hasn't been paid over about an 18-month period. So there are companies out there that just, almost make their living by not paying recruiters. Now, I wouldn't spend too much time thinking about, who do I need to pull credit on or go check. If they're, a publicly traded, A-sized company, that's going to be your S&P, New York Stock Exchange. Your B-sized companies are going to be, they may be publicly traded as well, but they may be a regional manufacturing facility or a grocery store or an automobile dealership or something along those lines. Those you still have to kind of keep an eye on, but not as much. The ones that I want you to keep an eye on are privately held small companies. And I would assume 70% of all of our clients are probably placing with C-size companies. You need to go back and recheck every single 6 to 12 months, just kind of see how they're doing. If it's contractors, quite frankly, I would request that you do that quite a bit more. Because they're, again, providing some services for recruiting and you don't get paid, you're out some time. If you provide contractors and you don't get paid, you're out a lot more than that. Also, what I want you to do is I want you to go through and I want you to pull an inventory of your documentation. This would be a good time to make sure that you have signed contracts, that you have, contracts that you can put your hands on, because I cannot tell you how many times we get in a collection and a client tells me, Wilson, I have a signed contract. Unfortunately, I don't know where it is. And the difference in having a signed contract and not having a signed contract doesn't mean that we wouldn't be able to collect it. We collect on unsigned contracts all the time. I can tell you on average, we're going to collect about 30 to 33% more with a signed contract, because the debtor doesn't have the same defense or defenses that they have if they don't have a signed contract. So make sure that you go through, this may be a great time to set up, one thing that we've done, and just kind of by our experience, we've always used paper fee agreements that give us permission to collect on a contingency basis, very similar to what you guys are doing. Over the last 6 months, we have converted over to a digital version, which we already had, but we started promoting it out of necessity because everybody was working remotely, and being able to print something off, in January may not have been a problem. Being able to print something off when they're working off of a laptop in the house and they haven't set up their printer yet becomes a much bigger problem. There's plenty of digital signature, whether it's DocuSign, HelloSign, Zoho Sign. There's a lot of different things that you have. Also, take this time to review and make sure your contract has several things. Number one, you want a possessory period that's between 12 and 24 months. So if you present somebody and they hire them, of course, you're owed a fee. A lot of our clients think, well, if I don't put it in there, then it means it lasts forever. I can tell you it's just the reverse, because the government basically says, or the courts basically say, hey, if you present a candidate and they don't hire them, would you be owed a fee in 6 months if they pay? And everybody says, yeah, that's reasonable. But let's say in 20 years or in 25 years, they hire that same candidate, instead of out of college, he's a middle-aged male, would they owe you a fee? Everybody says, Wilson, that's kind of ridiculous. Everybody, nobody's going to be paying a fee on that. And that's the point. Where is that line? And that demarcation line, industry standards is about 12 months, but let's assume you're dealing with a client that their terms and conditions say, well, gee, we only have to cover for 90 days. If you didn't get a signed contract, whose contract are you working out of? So 12 to 24 months. Another thing that I like to see in those contracts is you're protected 12 to 24 months from last discussion or presentation of that candidate, because everybody's hiring cycles and sales cycles vary. If you present somebody, let's say you presented somebody back in April of last year, a great candidate, and the hiring manager says, hey, Mr. Recruiter or Mrs. Recruiter, we're not going to hire him. We're on a hiring freeze. That's fine. Let's say you reach back out to them in February when all of this is over and they say, this guy or this lady's still available. Do you want them? And they don't respond, and they tick it out and they hire them in May. Well, it's outside the 12-month period of your original contract. They wouldn't owe you typically at that point. But if you send them an email and say, hey, I know you guys are about to gear back up. I wanted to bring your attention to Stephen Smith or whomever is still available. That resets that time limit. Also, you want to make sure that you have in those contracts that they agree to pay reasonable attorney's fees. They agree to pay collection costs. If you would like, you can email me, Wilson@aercollections.com. My assistant will send you our best practices fee agreement. that our staff attorney created. Now, we have to kind of walk a fine line. We cannot give you legal advice, even though she's an attorney. We're not a law firm, so we can't give you legal advice. But I can tell you from a collection standpoint, if I wanted to have something that was going to protect me, I'd want the safeguards that are in this fee agreement, best practices, and look at it as a buffet. Take from it what you like, discard what you don't, but it's absolutely free to all of our clients and NPA Worldwide members as well. So that's what you want to do. You also want to set up, and there again, I realize setting up credit lines with recruiters are probably, you've got a balance that you have to walk because you don't want to make it so restrictive. But in your mind, look at it and say, okay, am I willing to work 3 months straight for this client and be so busy trying to fill these orders and not work for any other clients? Are they pretty good? Do I feel like I'd get paid? Some clients you say, oh, absolutely, that's money in the bank. It would be the best quarter I ever have. Everybody else has that client that goes, oh my God, they're a pain in the backside to deal with. There's, I'd have to chase them for 6 months to get paid. And you know that going into it. My point being is kind of allocate your time in how you deal with the clients based on their credit worthiness. There again, go out and do a Google search and or go out and pull one of the universal credit reports. Most companies, like if you have someone that doesn't pay you, you don't pick up the phone and call Dun and Bradstreet and say, hey, these guys paid me at 120 days. You don't do it. No one does it. Where Dun and Bradstreet gets their reporting from is institutional creditors. So that's going to be the banks, the credit cards, major suppliers. And then also where you're going to show up in those credit reports is either if you turn them over to collections and Dun and Bradstreet, or the other ones pick it up, or you're going to show up in lawsuits. And so that's why I want you to go out. And everybody says, initially they'll tell me, Wilson, going out and pulling a Google search, that seems like a waste of time, until they get burned by somebody. And there was an individual that I'm not going to mention their name, but I know that there were clients of ours with NPA that had dealt with this particular client. He is now sitting in jail because he was a delicensed stockbroker and just a swindler from the word go. And he wound up sticking it to a funding company for several $100,000. Well, the guy that owned the funding company probably spent as much as he was owed and basically got an FBI investigation going on, and they shut him down. My point being is 2 of those clients that were later burned by this particular recruiter, and they would have quickly found out this was not somebody that they probably wanted to deal with. As soon as you pulled up any type of Google search, it pulled up tons and tons and tons and tons of information. So if you're going to pull a credit report, USA Today or US Credit or what have you has one, Cortera has one, we have our own credit product, and all of them are about $50 a month, unlimited searches. But also go out and Google, because that's going to save you a lot of frustration and a lot of heartache, especially with the professional debtors that you have out there. Now, Veronica, I know that there are some of the folks, because we have the technical issues, I know some had shared some questions for the last meeting. What are some of those questions now that I can answer? And anybody else that has some questions, please speak up.
Sure. If a company goes out of business, can you still go after the owners for unpaid invoices?
That's a great question. I'm asked that quite a bit. And let me tell you, probably not. And I'll get a call from a client and it simply goes something like this. Hey, Wilson, there was a guy we did business with and they closed down. I think they changed their name or something, but I know where he lives or I know where the new company is. I hate to tell them, as soon as they tell me that, I know the answer is there's nothing that we're going to be able to do. LLCs and corporations were built and designed to protect individuals from personal liability. So if you do business with somebody or with a company and that company shuts down and you don't have a personal guarantee, then that debt pretty much dies with that corporation. You may be able to find an attorney that says, hey, we can pop the corporate veil and they can tell you all the stuff that they're going to do. And the litmus test that I utilize is when they tell you that, say, well, will you be willing to do it on a contingency basis? And that attorney will probably shudder a little bit, say, oh, no, our fees are $300, $400 an hour, but we just couldn't handle a case like that on a contingency basis. If he's telling you he cannot handle it on a contingency basis, he's in essence telling you he doesn't think that there's any money there. So I never recommend that anybody spend money on a collection case outside of court costs, and trying to pop a corporate veil for less than hundreds of thousands of dollars just simply doesn't work out in most cases.
Thanks for that. And I know you touched on this briefly a little bit earlier, but for those who are working in the staffing side or maybe using a factoring service, what happens if that client defaults?
I tell you, that is, I am shocked at how many recruiters come to us when they have a problem and they're doing all of these. And there again, contract is a great way to go. It's consistent cash flow. And there's some wonderful resources out there. But most of them, if you look at their master terms of agreement, you're on the hook as much as your debtor. And if that company doesn't pay, in most cases, and I'd say about 99% of the cases, the recruiter is going to be the one that ultimately owes the bill. It's almost like they co-signed, for lack of a better word, for this debtor to pay. And, if all of a sudden you look up and you've got a $60,000 non-paying contractor bill, it gets very, very expensive. And I'm not saying it put you out of business, but it will certainly affect the end of the year profits if you wind up having to come up with 60 grand out of pocket because somebody didn't pay you.
Good advice, and a little bit of a scary situation. I don't see any other questions coming in, and my Q&A pod is all cleared out, nothing in the chat.
Okay.
I think we're probably getting to the end here, so that's great. I want to thank you, Wilson, for sharing that information and advice with the group. It's interesting times that we're living in for sure, and definitely smart to go just making sure you've got a little extra protection that you maybe didn't need to worry about last year, but certainly is an issue this year.
Well, in my opinion, Veronica, it's going to get a little bit more because, a little bit more precarious because as we move forward and as the government has to pull out, at one point during the beginning of the lockdown, the government injected, I've seen varying figures, but somewhere between $3 and $6 trillion to kind of give you perspective. They doubled or tripled the amount of money that was flowing through the economy at any point. That money, some of it's been pulled out in very small doses, but a lot of it is still circulating. And so they're going to have to pull that money back out. And when that happens, lenders are going to tighten up. And that's why I'm recommending these SBA loans, because interest rates are going to have to increase at some point, but also just accessibility to these loans. And if somebody says, well, Wilson, I didn't do that much payroll, or they get confused. It's not payroll. It is a 6 months worth of operating expenses loans. They're capping them at $150,000, or they started doing that so they didn't run out of money. Originally, it was up to $2 million. But they're capping them at $150,000. And if you're going to use them yourself, that's great. If you have other business owners that that are struggling, and I don't want to say that they're risk-free, because nothing is risk-free and there can be tax ramifications. But there are restaurant tours I know here in Atlanta that I've talked to on the debtor side, and they were about to close down their business. And they had no idea that they had these access to the SBA loans, and they own 2 different restaurants. And they were able to go out, get $300,000, 30-year payout, no payment for 12 months. And they not only got our client paid, but they even sent me a thank you note, because they were about to shut down. They've been in business 10, 15 years. Their whole lives were about to go up in smoke. And so my point being is, if you're not going to use them for yourself, your clients may have access to them. And depending on, if you're in hospitality or if you're in manufacturing, those are the ones that seem to have been the most beat up or are fighting the biggest cash flow. Service businesses are still doing pretty good because everybody is working from home and still managing to generate revenue. But keep in mind, and I'm not a big loan guy, went 20 some odd years without loans, but I would recommend using that as a sales feature for the client. These loans, sometime right after the first of the year, probably certainly by the end of the first quarter, they're going to dry up, and they won't be readily available unless you're in a hurricane or your town's hit by a tornado or something along those lines. So that's my 2 cents on it. And just practice good business practices and use this time to kind of get everything going more digital on the paperwork, in my opinion.
Thanks so much for that, Wilson. And I know that's great advice for all of our members. I just want to remind everybody, we will be back on January 7th with a session with Jeff Kay. Watch for sign-up details on that in the probably next week. We'll get that going a little bit early because we know everyone's going to be getting away from the office for a bit for the holidays. So again, thanks for your time. Thanks for being here. Have a wonderful holiday season, a happy new year, and a successful 2021.
Thank you, Veronica.
Thanks, everyone.